Hello everyone, today I'm going to be doing something slightly different and doing a more theory-based video and showing you guys how you can use GTO solvers in order to build a complete model of certain situations that happen in poker. So I'll be focusing on the button steal situation where it's folded to the button and we have the choice to open raise, and then the small blind and big blind will have to defend with flatting ranges and 3-betting ranges. Now this type of complete model building isn't an exercise that you have to do for every situation in poker, but if you want to say that you 100% understand a spot, I think it's the type of knowledge that needs to be strived towards in the future, and I don't see this kind of analysis kind of cropping up in many poker strategy discussions. So in this case, if you know a picture is worth 1,000 words, and a picture is, say, a single GTO simulation, certainly a model is worth 1,000 pictures in this case. So we'll be able to use our model to tinker to our liking and see how EVs are captured in different strategies and how sensitive the equilibrium is to different strategy choice. All useful knowledge for implementation at the table, certainly useful for exploitative play. Now the button steal situation is chosen for a reason. If you're familiar with the history of poker training videos, you'll know that the button steal situation is kind of a essential theory video staple, where people are using their notepad equity calculations with different assumptions on equities and folding ranges to see how much button should open, how much the blinds should defend, that kind of thing. So what's nice with poker solvers, we can solve this question kind of exactly, but with the model building that I'm doing here, I'd like to kind of return to this type of analysis and kind of expose the skeleton of the equilibrium more concretely so that we can facilitate kind of a better understanding of where the equity is coming from and how deviations can apply. Here's a screenshot of Phil Galfond using these equity calculations to justify shoving Jack-8 suited, 4-bet shoving button versus big blind here for about 77k. I think this is in like the year 2008 or something like that. And before you hate, he does get a fold, so you can't say that it's not justified because he's using this for just kind of an exploitative reason. But this is a favorite clip of mine from the olden days of Phil Galfond pulling up the notepad and ripping in Jack-8 suited. Good meme. Now, when I say that I want to build a model of the button versus blind steal scenario, what exactly do I mean or hope to achieve? I mean, running aggregate analyses, I can run a certain spot, button versus big blind, where the big blind flats. So here's like an opening range for me on the button. A bit wider than equilibrium, but you can't stop me from opening a bit wider on the button. And here's a typical flatting range, GTO-ish in the big blind for, you know, roughly 25 NL rake type of scenario, so 31% flatting range. And I can run this on a 49 flop subset, average the EVs, and I'll have a rough picture of how much EV the big blind is capturing in this scenario and how much EV the button gets here, you know, 3 blinds out of the 5.5 blind pot size, right? And what I want to do is have an aggregate type of report for every portion of the game tree that happens in this kind of blinds versus button scenario. So when the big blind 3-bets and I call on the button, I want an aggregate analysis for that situation. So this is the 3-bet pot type of situation, as well as having aggregate analyses for, you know, when the small blind flats, since the GTO flatting ranges are typical, as well as they're prevalent in population. So it's worthwhile to have kind of that portion of the game tree modeled fairly accurately, as well as when the small blind 3-bets, here I have it 3-betting to a smaller size than the big blind, and when I flat a slightly wider range, what happens? And each of these scenarios in the game tree, I've varied the ranges on the button, as well as, you know, the flatting ranges of the big blind, the small blind, according to population trends, but also just like random wider ranges and tighter ranges to see what they look like. And I'll be using this kind of information, this kind of wide scope of different strategy choices based on these aggregate analyses to build a model of how EV changes when people select different strategies. So I'll know what EV looks like when I open 100% on the button, and what happens when I'm opening 100% and the big blind starts flattening really wide. Do I get absolutely demolished, right? That's the kind of information that I'm looking to look at. And with this information, I can kind of see what the equilibrium looks like. How sensitive is it? If GTO says I need to open 44% on the button, is it really that big of a deal if I open 60% or something like that? Are the EVs that different in theory if I'm playing a GTO opponent who isn't deviating, or if I'm playing an opponent who might try to actively counter-exploit that? So that's the type of thing that we'll be looking to see. Okay, now before making a full model where I'm able to incorporate all those simulation results, I'm going to start with just a more simpler EV calculation for, what is the EV on the button. So it's folded to you on the button. You're going to open 47% of hands like I do. And, what is your big blind per 100 from that position? So we'll do an equity calculation, which will be fundamental towards our model. And we'll do this to check our sanity here. So we'll do an equity calculation for this situation. What is the button's big blind per 100, and see if it makes sense. So this is a lot on the spreadsheet. So I'll just walk you through it. Generally what calculations I'm doing. I won't get into specifics. If you have questions on how I'm calculating a specific thing in the model, feel free to ask in the comments, and I'll answer. So up here, this is basically just data from my database on population statistics. So how often I'm getting 3-bet from the different positions and flatted, that kind of thing. So you don't have to worry about this too much. Here are the ranges though. So here's the population frequencies and solver frequencies, which I've gotten these solver results from preflop simulations, actually at Zenith Poker. Who have, if you haven't checked out, they do really good kind of GTO training material, and they have a really nice set of preflop simulations, which are just offered free to anyone who signs up. So I can highly recommend it. Yeah, basically, population here is flattening the small blind way too much at 12.6%. Solver likes to carve out like a 5% range. Small blind 3-bet population is re-stealing here 11% of the time. Solver a bit more. Big blind's flatting in the population about 29%. Solver likes about 31% for 25 NL rake. So they're pretty close there. And big blind 3-betting 10.4% in population and 13.4% in the solver. So basically what I'm accomplishing in this spreadsheet is calculating the button EV versus a solver strategy preflop, and what is my button EV versus population preflop, without altering my strategy at all. So just opening my ranges here, which is I open the button 47%. I call versus different 3-bet sizings, these percentages here. So I'm defending less against the largest 3-bet sizing from the big blind, 13.5. So I'll be using the 13.5 big blind for the solver EV calculation, but I'll be using this smaller big blind 3-bet size for the population analysis. As well as my 4-bet frequencies for the different sizings as well. And here is an EV calculation of what happens when the button 4-bets. And since I'm not, with a solver, every time I change something, calculating 4-bet EVs, I've had to make kind of my own model for this. And what I've done is, for validation purposes, I've taken actually the EVs of all the different hands that I decide the 4-bet here. and taken them off of the Zenith Poker simulation results. So these EVs are directly from the preflop sims. And from that, I can see that I expect an EV of about 8 big blinds out of the pot every time I 4-bet. Now, problem with just taking this off of a single simulation is that it's not a dynamic model. I can't like change the big blinds 3-bet frequencies and have this change the EV. So I've had to make a further simplification to the model, which I think ends up being quite justified since things don't change very much and the EVs end up being quite close. And basically what the simplification entails is it assumes that out of position, so small blind and big blind, isn't ever going to be calling my 4-bet. It's just either going to be 5-betting this 4.8% portion of the range. So this includes like 10s, jacks to aces, ace kings, a bit of ace queen, and ace 10 suited actually. So kind of like this GTO 5-bet shoving range here. And what it actually does is, calculates, okay, how often are they going to be 5-bet shoving me? So if they're 3-betting a very tight range, I expect them to be shoving this range into be very often when I 4-bet. As opposed to if they're 3-betting a much loose range, then they're just going to be folding to my 4-bet fairly often, but 5-betting somewhat less often. So it's just calculating the EV of them folding to my 4-bet, or they shove into me this 4.8% range, and I call, with ace, ace, and then I have my, 83% equity calculated from Poker Stove. So I've done that for all of my hands, which I'll be, 4-bet calling. So ace, king, 10s plus, basically. Whereas my 4-bet bluffs, I just give them folding EV. So negative 2.5 big blinds in this case. So usually bluffs are hovering around this point. Some with very good blocker effects are a bit more, but in the EV calculation, really it doesn't matter that much. We're just looking to get kind of bulk EV changes with strategy choice here. So since the 4-bet, 5-bet scenario doesn't really happen that very often, it's not vital that, this be accurate, down to 0.1, EV kind of thing. It really doesn't have an effect on the end results very much. And one interesting thing that I found is, with this EV calculation, this 7.3 big blinds now out of the pot, is now if I change the big blinds 3-bet frequency to say 8% as opposed to, the 13.4%, EV really doesn't change very much. Now the EV of specifically ace-ace goes way up when big blind starts 3-betting much tighter when I 4-bet, obviously, because he's going to be jamming much more often into my ace-ace, which is nice. But other hands like 10s, jacks, ace, king, those EVs start going down, right? And it ends up being just kind of balanced by that. So, if I really wanted to properly exploit that 8% 3-bet range, I would, 4-bet a tighter range into it, just like jacks plus or something, and start flatting, some ace, king, and 10-10, and a bit of jacks, I suppose, and strengthen my calling range, and end up realizing more EV that way. But we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to say that my, response on the button is going to remain, solidly similar, and maybe we can change things later. Most importantly, we're just going to be changing my opening button range in the future. So everything else, like 4-betting ranges and 3-bet calling ranges, we won't be changing in our model very much in the future. So in this 4-bit EV calculation, I've done that for the different 3-bet sizings, which is all well and good. As well, I have a similar calculation that I'll use down the line for actually a 5-bet EV calculation for when small blind 3-bets and big blind 4-bets. And now I'm facing like a cold 4-bet. I have an EV calculation for me jamming in aces, 10s plus there, that kind of thing, just for completeness, right? So that sets it up for the most important part of the model, which is the EV calculations for all the points of the game tree shown here. So this has EV calculations for me versus GTO ranges here. So we'll look at those first. And this is for same calculations, but just with population ranges. So exact same thing. So here we have EV small blind folds, big blind folds. You know, I win 1.5 big blinds, right? Here we have EV small blind folds, big blind flats, right? And this is actually pulled from aggregate analysis of the GTO plus simulations. So this number, 50.6 big blinds per 100 in this case, so 0.5 big blinds per hand, is pulled off a separate spreadsheet, EV when the big blind flats, where I have here me versus GTO ranges. We get this 3.01 big blinds out of the pot when big blind flats, which, you know, after we subtract the 2.5 we put in, we get a net EV of 50 big blinds per 100 when this event happens, right? Okay, now moving down the line, when big blind 3 bets and I fold, negative 2.5 big blinds, right? And, you know, without going down all the specifics here, we have the same type of scenario for when the big blind's 3 bets and I call. I pulled that off aggregate GTO plus simulations, so that's negative 2.19 or sorry, 220 big blinds per 100 negative when we call here. We have the EVs of when I 3-bet and I 4-bet, so that's what I just explained here, EV of my 4-betting ranges, as well as I have the same thing but for the small blind scenarios. Basically the whole game tree is summarized here. If you have any questions about specifics, you can ask in the comments, but just basic kind of EV calculations using all the frequencies here. I'm sure some of you have seen these type of EV calculations in all sorts of poker videos and stuff. I'm not too concerned of getting into the weeds on that. I want to get to kind of the bulk results is the more important thing. So in the end, you know, running this down, so what is my EV when the small blind folds? You know, I'm in a good position. This is the button's EV when I decide to open my 47% hands. And this is my overall EV. So I only open 47% of the time. So this is going to be like half my opening EV, right? So EV I should expect when it's folded to me, I'm on the button. You know, I have a decision. I have a random hand. Do I open? Do I not open? EV in that scenario should be 24 big blinds per 100. And I'm losing at 25 NL about 7.2 big blinds per 100 in EV to the rake, right? So that's a big oof, but you know, you got to do what you got to do. So the question is, this whole spreadsheet we've put together, this kind of, you know, baseline for our model. We're going to be using this model for calculating all sorts of things. Does this sound correct? Well, we should do a sanity check here, right? 24 big blinds per 100. Well, it's positive, which we expect. We're on the button. We should be winning money here as opposed to losing. And in fact, if I go into my database, I can filter for this spot precisely for when it's an unopened pot and I'm on the button. So I can filter just easily in my Hold'em manager for when I'm on the button and I want to open. And my EV in this spot is I'm winning 34 big blinds per 100. So that's roughly beating rake by, you know, 3 big blinds per 100. So it seems like it's in the ballpark, right? Now, I only have 15,000 instances of this scenario, so it's still affected by convergence in my database. In fact, I think, you know, my win rate here is a bit lower than I should expect, given I should have a decent more edge than that, and I expect most of my edge to be realized on the button, if anywhere else. So I have 15,000 hands in this scenario. You know, the standard deviation of this position is a bit lower, so this is roughly equivalent to, you know, someone posting their win rate after 40,000 hands or something like that, I would equate it to. And if I look at my different stake levels, I can see, at some stakes where I have, like 6,000 hands in this scenario, my win rate here is, 42 big blinds per 100. It's at another stake, it's at, 26 big blinds per 100. So it's still affected by variance. If anyone wants to filter for this spot in their database, post it in the comments. I'd be interested in looking at it for sure. But I think this is ballpark making sense territory for what the EV is here. And just to complete what I've done in the spreadsheet, here's the same EV calculations, but using the population ranges. And here I'm just opening 47% into population. They're just kind of defending suboptimally. And here the button EV is 26.4 big blinds per 100. So I gain about 2 big blinds per 100 in this position. 2.5 big blinds per 100 in this position against population just from their pre-flop mistakes, which actually isn't very much as I expected. Considering the amount of rake, 7 big blinds per 100 that's happening, and in order to carve out a win rate, over rake, plus I need to, I want to be winning, at the micro stakes, I want to hit that like, 6 to 10 big blinds per 100 type of scenario. In order to carve that out, I really need quite an edge. That's like a 15 big blind per 100 edge I need to be carving out in as an aggregate over all positions, right? So this type of pre-flop mistake isn't really accounting for much of that, Okay, along with the EV calculations, I've done a rough calculation of what is the uncertainty in each of the calculations where it's available, based on the convergence level of the solver that I used, 0.5%, as well as there's an uncertainty associated with using a flop subset, 49 flops, of roughly, it maxes out, roughly at like, 1% of the pot for different hand classes and stuff like that. So I just took like 1% uncertainty due to using 49 flops and 0.5% due to convergence of the solve and applied that to the different scenarios. Except for the 4-bet uncertainty, I have that associated with the difference between 8 and the 7.3 here. So roughly like 0.7 big blinds uncertainty for 4-bet scenarios, and carried that through the calculations. So roughly uncertainties here, our EVs are uncertain to within 0.5 big blinds per 100. For the uncertainties I've been able to quantify, there are some uncertainties associated with, are these frequencies, correct? Probably not exactly. If you change them slightly, or if the solver is off in different ways, perhaps there's some additional uncertainty here. But from what I've been able to quantify or handle with some of my simplifying assumptions, this is appropriate. So what else can we see to validate that our model is working? Let's have a look at, 4-bet EV. So let's say I make a mistake here and my 4-bet EV was actually, like 10 big blinds per 100 instead of the 7.3. You can see the EVs change, like 1 big blind per 100, which, for that big a mistake is, not that big of a deal, I suppose. But let's have a look at what happens when we change frequencies. Do things make sense? So let's say we end up getting 3-bet at 16% frequency instead of the 13.4. What happens to our EV? And you can see it tanks a bit, almost just about 3 big blinds per 100. So having someone over 3-bet us can be bad news. But this is kind of exposes the problem with our model in its current state in this spreadsheet, is that it doesn't take into account that we change this frequency to 16%, doesn't take into account the fact that there are now a bunch of weaker hands in that 3-betting range, right? It still assumes, though the frequency has changed to 16%, it still assumes that big blind here has 13.4% of hands or whatever, right? So in actuality, we shouldn't expect this deviation to change the EV so much, right? Because it should be deviating from GTO. So to handle this dynamic part of the model, I pulled out my good friend MATLAB, and what I've done is taken all these previous aggregate reports that I showed before, taken all the EVs from them, and created an interpolating function. So now I have, what are the EVs when I open, anywhere from 30 to 100% of hands? What happens when the big blind flats anywhere from 22% of hands to 54% of hands? And I've taken all the points that I have for the different EVs here, and now I'm able to interpolate any strategy that I want and get a rough idea of what is the EV for that strategy. So this is quite useful, allows us to dynamically change everything in our model, right? Okay, so now finally getting to all the work done into putting together this model is to create a plot kind of like this, where we have on the x-axis our button opening strategy, so opening anywhere from 30 to 100% of hands, and on the y-axis we have the EV of that strategy on the button. So we have here for opening our 47% of hands, we have that roughly 23 big blinds per 100 EV, and the shaded region here is kind of the uncertainty bounds of the strategy. And what we can see, this black line is what is our EV versus people playing GTO in the small blind and in the big blind. What we can see is that versus a GTO opponent, there's this kind of wide band of acceptable opening ranges. So as long as my opponents stay near GTO frequencies, I can open anywhere between 40% and upwards to 65, 70% of hands, and the equilibrium isn't very sensitive to these changes in strategies. Now, if I'm getting counter exploited, that's a different scenario. But as long as my opponents are kind of fixed, kind of playing GTO strategies, there really isn't very much difference between me opening 40% of hands and 70% of hands in theory, right? In practice, maybe I should think of choose one over the other as a better way to realize my edge. Since I'm in position, maybe I favor opening 65% of hands if I know that my opponents are not counter exploiting, of course. If they start 3-betting me a ton, then I expect my EV to drop for 65% opening range, which is away from equilibrium for me, right? But this is useful. We can get similar curves for versus my population ranges in red here. And versus population, what this hints at is that I should be opening about 75% of hands to maximize my EV versus population, since they're on the whole just under 3-betting me, allowing me to get post-flop and realizing my EV, as well as not kind of overfolding in the big blind slightly. So a lot of those crappy hands that rely on the folding equity in the big blind are happy there. So this is the population with 10% 3-bet, 28% flat in the big blind. And in the blue, I've done kind of a further scenario where I have a particularly needy person in the big blind. So not even that particularly needy. This is actually like a fairly common player type, I would say. So defending with an 8% 3-bet in the big blind and 22% flatting range. Certainly not out of the ordinary. And in the small blind, I have the person just playing at population. So the person in the small blind in these population scenarios is, flatting 12%, 3-betting 10% or whatever garbage they're playing. But if I have a slightly nitty player in the big blind, all of a sudden, opening 100% on the button becomes very attractive compared to, my 47% opening, which was, if I have a nitty player, I'm doing quite well. I'm getting, 31 big blinds per 100. So I'm almost going to be beating rake, that's 7 big blinds per 100, just from them making pre-flop mistakes in this scenario. But I can see that the EV on the table for opening 100% of hands is upwards to, an additional like 9 big blinds per 100, which isn't nothing, right? As well, one thing to consider is that, when I'm opening 100% of hands here, I'm using solver solutions here for this case, right? So the solver knows that I'm opening 100% of hands and will play post-flop accordingly to maximize their EV. The typical nit, playing Zoom micros, isn't going to be making optimal decisions post-flop. So there's something to be said for the EV here being even higher if I'm going to be exploiting the nit post-flop as well. So this I see as kind of like a green light to open 100% of hands against, nits in the big blinds, and not very worried very much about it. If they 3-bet me, I just like fold, like 90% of my range, and that is incorporated in my model here, right? Now, one thing to be wary about when taking a exploit like opening your button opening range is you need to be cognizant of what happens if there's a counter exploit going on and, say, for example, the big blind starts flatting a much wider range or 3-betting you more aggressively. So this is something that we can just ask our model and get a picture of what's going on in that situation. So for that, we'll keep with the GTO solution. So working with this black curve here. And the only thing we'll change in the strategy compared to versus a GTO opponent is we'll keep the same 3-bet frequencies, but we'll vary the big blind's flatting frequency. So what happens to buttons EV when big blind starts flatting much tighter or much wider than optimal 31% that we used in this curve here. And if we do that for a wide range of flatting frequencies, we can generate a bunch of curves here for different flatting frequencies from the big blind. The cyan colored curve here is the curve we were working with previously. So this is the equilibrium EV for the button. And what we find is that if the big blind is flatting much tighter, our EVs across the board go up. And, if we want to exploit, we can open wider. It's kind of obvious thing we're looking at. But the interesting thing is that kind of the wider our opening range is, the more sensitive the EV becomes to the big blind's flatting range. So if big blind starts flatting, upwards to 50%, 60% of hands, our EV starts tanking like really bad in that situation. So definitely need to be careful if you're going crazy opening your button range. You really need to be sure that your opponents are static. Now, good thing about nits is that they tend to be fairly static. They really don't like 3-betting out of position. There's kind of nothing that will rock them into doing something like that. So you don't have to worry about nits too much in my experience, but it's up to you, I suppose, whether you want to keep with GTO strategies or take the exploit. One interesting thing that deserves some unpacking here is that as the big blind starts flatting wider and wider ranges here, so upwards to 67% of hands, the EVs just keep on going down for the button, which is kind of unfortunate. Kind of if the big blind is flatting much wider, the proper exploit of that is actually to open in tighter, which is not exactly what you might envision, or what I intuitively envisioned might be the proper exploit. My feeling was that, okay, we have our GTO opening frequency at 47%, 44%, whatever it is, and if the blinds are playing less than optimally, that can only mean our hands gain EV. But that isn't really the case, because even in an optimal opening range, there are a number of hands that still rely on the equilibrium fold equity from the blinds. So there's lots of crappy hands in our opening range that when called from the big blind, they don't make back the 2.5 big blinds in the pot. So they really need that equity. fold equity. But this doesn't mean just because we are losing EV on the button that the big blind should be flatting much wider and killing our EV here, because of rake, actually. So if we look at the big blind's EV versus their flatting frequency, this curve is generated for if we opened on the button 47% of the time. We can see, yeah, at these higher flatting frequencies, they just start losing EV as well. So in that case, we're both kind of just paying more rake, and the big blind should really stick at equilibrium to around this like 30% type of range that the solver likes, right? So it's kind of unfortunate, but the introduction of rake into the game kind of makes things a bit weird pre-flop, where now the other players or your opponents have the opportunity to kind of mess with your EV away from GTO by playing non-optimally, right? So even opening like a GTO type of frequency, I can lose EV from that because of rake if someone's flatting wider and playing a bunch of hands and kind of ruining it for the both of us. So we can see that more clearly if we plot these same curves, but what they would look like in red now is if the game had no rake. And what we find is that the same thing holds, that it's the proper exploit to open slightly tighter if the big blind starts flatting wider. But at least at some point, once we reach the equilibrium values, this lower curve here you can think of as the equilibrium. Once the big blind starts flatting past that, our ranges start gaining EV and we're happy, right? So in this case, when there's no rake, we have this kind of nice zero-sum game where we can play GTO and be happy and know that our opponent, if they're playing non-optimally, will just kind of feed our range a bit more EV, right? We may be able to exploit it more maximally by, say, if they're flatting tighter, we can open wider, or if they're flatting wider over here, we can open tighter. But if we play GTO, we can be happy. The same can't be said for these bottom curves where there's rake, right? Here, if we're playing GTO at this 47% frequency or whatever, if the big blind starts flatting really wide, he can start messing with our money. So unfortunate. Same type of scenario can hold for, say, like tournaments where there's a bunch of ICM pressure, if you're familiar with that situation, where, say, there's 3 players left, there's one of them that's extreme short stack, and there's 2 of you just kind of waiting for the short stack to bust. If you're playing at equilibrium, the 2 larger stacks can start shoving into each other, right? Knowing that the other stack shouldn't call and ruin it, ruin the pay jump for the rest of them. But if the other opponent is a fish and starts calling, you know, at a non-optimum frequency, and you're shoving 100% of your hands into them with 3 people left and a short stack at the table, that type of situation can be disastrous for you. So it's similar pre-flop in that situation. Kind of a similar type of scenario is happening. Kind of in the extreme case as well, kind of a nugget that you can get from this introduction of rake into the game, making it non-zero sum, is particularly in pre-flop sims where you have a very high rake environment. Because ranges start getting very tight and flatting ranges start getting very tight in that situation, the hand regions themselves start weighting towards, you know, offsuit combos of like ace X, king X, because hands start relying at the equilibrium. So when everyone is folding and playing very, very tightly, hands start really relying on fold equity pre-flop for their value. So solvers, and you can see this in kind of the, if you're familiar with Poker Snowy, their ranges in high rake environments, they start adding a bunch of offsuit combos that are kind of like weird counterintuitive ranges. And those are fine for if everyone at the table is playing equilibrium ranges and is folding a bunch, then they're good. But those ranges can suffer perhaps much more drastically than traditional ranges if you have a bunch of opponents at the table that aren't playing, these type of ranges, or close to GTO in a very high rake environment. If they're, flatting still 30% of hands from the big blind and stuff like that, then those ranges might be in trouble in that situation. And so it's something to consider while looking at these pre-flop simulations with rake, whether you really want to be playing those ranges or not, and optimizing accordingly. So in my view, introduction of rake pre-flop kind of makes me incentivized to play more exploitative pre-flop. And, if I know that there's a loose player in the big blind, then, I'm going to play, tighter ranges and not open 100% and really fight against this big equity hole that is there. Unless they're, a complete fish post-flop and I can realize my edge. Otherwise, I can make that judgment call, but I need to be knowing that I'm fighting against rake. So I'll end the video there. There is still a lot more we can do with the model, so I'll be doing a second part of this video, but I'll stop at this point and I'll put it over to commenters if they want to see something explored specifically in the model, in the blind battle situation. So there's a number of things we can look at. We can look at what the equilibrium looks like. Say if we have a player on the button that is flatting 3-bets very wide, what do the equilibrium curves look like for, selection of strategy from the big blind? Should I be 3-betting more? That type of thing. And if you have any comments on the model or how I calculated certain things, questions like that, I'd be happy to answer them. If you see an error anywhere or want to discuss anything related to the strategy, I'd be happy to open up discussion in the comments. That'd be great. Otherwise, see you next time.